Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozarks of northern Arkansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1938, and the Ozark Mountains were already known as a place where sound carried strangely. Locals said a shout could travel a mile if the wind was right, bouncing off limestone bluffs and folding back on itself until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. That autumn arrived early. Cold rain settled into the hollows, and fog clung low to the ridgelines long after sunrise. County road ledgers from Madison and Newton counties note repeated washouts that season, cutting off several homesteads for days at a time. Isolation was not unusual here, but that year it felt heavier, more complete. Several of the farms affected lay near the eastern edge of what would later be formally managed as part of the Ozark National Forest. At the time, it was simply referred to as the federal land, recently reorganized and patrolled by a handful of rangers whose reports focused mostly on timber disputes and illegal hunting. Their presence would matter later, though no one realized it at the time. The first written mention of anything unusual appears in a church journal kept by Reverend Eli Mercer of Dry Creek Chapel. On October 11, he recorded a brief aside after noting attendance numbers. Congregation disturbed by noise from hills last night. Several families claimed screaming heard after dusk. No animals seen. The entry was not emphasized. Mercer moved on to notes about coal shortages and a coming frost, but the screaming did not stop. Within a week, 3 separate households submitted complaints to the county clerk. These were not dramatic statements, just simple affidavits written in uneven pencil. Mrs. Clara Whitten described a sound like a woman calling out but longer, wrong somehow. A hog farmer named Leland Price wrote that his stock had broken fencing after sundown, spooked by a cry that came from up the ridge, and then below us both. He added, almost apologetically, that he had lived there 20 years and knew the calls of panthers and foxes. Sheriff's logs show no immediate response. Rural noise complaints rarely warranted investigation unless accompanied by theft or violence. Still, the entries accumulated. By late October, the county received a letter from a school teacher, Miss Ruth Calder, who reported children refusing to walk home alone after evening lessons. She noted that the sound seemed to follow no pattern, sometimes heard 2 nights in a row, sometimes not at all. What unsettled officials most was not the volume of the noise, but its timing. Nearly every account placed it between full dark and midnight, never later, never at dawn. As one unnamed deputy later testified, it was like something new when folks were listening. Early speculation leaned toward wildlife displaced by land clearing near the federal tracts. The Ozark National Forest reorganization had altered hunting boundaries, and rangers acknowledged increased animal movement. That explanation appeared in a short local newspaper column, printed without a headline, and was accepted publicly. Privately, doubts remained, because animals did not usually scream like they were asking to be heard. In the weeks that followed Reverend Mercer's journal entry, the sound acquired a name, though no one could say exactly when it began to circulate. It appeared first in conversation, then in a single marginal note written in the back of a seed ledger kept by the Harris family. Old folks say it's the howler. Nothing more was written, as if explanation itself felt unnecessary. The Ozark howler was not new to the mountains. Long before 1938, it had lived quietly in spoken warnings and half-joking advice given to children at dusk. County folklore collectors had noted it in passing years earlier, usually dismissing it as a composite of known animals and fear. Descriptions varied slightly, but certain details stayed fixed. A body shaped like a bear, eyes that reflected light like a cat's, and a scream that rose and fell like a wolf's howl, only longer, strained, and somehow deliberate. The important part of the story was never what it looked like. It was what it did to people who heard it alone. A retired trapper named Silas Crowell told a neighbor that same autumn, "You hear that thing when you're by yourself, you don't walk straight after. Woods twist up on you." Crowell refused afterward to check his lines after sunset, something he had done routinely for decades. As the stories spread, practical concerns followed. Hunting parties shortened their trips. A timber crew contracted near the federal land requested to bunk together, instead of sleeping in staggered camps. Their foreman later signed an affidavit stating that one worker, Thomas Reed, became disoriented less than half a mile from camp after hearing what he thought was a woman crying for help. Reed was found before dawn, barefoot, sitting in a dry creek bed he knew well. He could not explain how he got there. Sheriff Harlan Fitch finally took notice after a second report of missing livestock came in. A mule belonging to the Avery family vanished overnight without broken fencing or tracks leading away from the property. What was found instead were deep impressions near the tree line, pressed unevenly into wet soil, as if something heavy had paused there and shifted its weight. Fitch dismissed them publicly as bear sign, though bears were rarely seen that far south that year. Internally, the sheriff requested assistance from a ranger assigned to the nearby federal tracts, land increasingly referred to in official correspondence by its new designation tied to the Ozark National Forest. Ranger William Klein's notes were brief and cautious. He recorded hearing an extended vocalization inconsistent with known wildlife on the night of November 2nd. He added that the sound carried downhill, then uphill again, without clear direction. By then, the screaming had developed a rhythm. It appeared most often after rain, when fog thickened the hollows and muffled smaller noises. Dogs refused to bark during it. One farmer claimed his hounds crawled under the porch and would not come out until morning. Another testified that his radio lost signal each time the sound began, though technicians later found nothing wrong with the set. Local newspapers avoided sensational language, but they could not ignore the growing unease. One short column mentioned renewed discussion of the so-called howler legend, framing it as a curiosity revived by hard times. The article ended with reassurance that no harm had been reported. That statement would not remain true for long. By mid-November, harm began to take quieter forms. No bodies were discovered. No blood was found. Instead, there were absences that sat uneasily in the record books. On November 14th, A Works Progress Administration roll from a road crew near Pettigrew showed one name crossed out without explanation. The man, listed as Harold Vance, had walked away from the bunkhouse after supper the previous evening. His coat remained on the back of his chair. His boots were still by the door. Fellow workers told the foreman they heard the screaming shortly after dark, somewhere upslope, followed by what one described as a second sound, like breath being pulled too hard through a throat. Search efforts were brief and poorly documented. The terrain was unforgiving and the rain returned before daylight. Ranger Klein joined the search with 2 deputies. His later report mentions finding Vance's hat in a thicket less than a mile from camp, dry despite the weather. There were no tracks leading away from it. The report ends with a single line: "Search discontinued due to conditions." In town, explanations hardened into habits. People stopped asking who or what made the sound and focused instead on how to avoid it. Lamps were lit earlier. Families gathered in single rooms after supper. The road past Dry Creek Chapel went unused at night, though it was the shortest route between 2 farms. Children were warned not to answer voices from the woods, even if they sounded familiar. The Ozark Howler became a convenient container for fear, a way to speak about the unspeakable without naming it directly. Miss Calder, the schoolteacher, wrote to her sister that the children now drew the same figure repeatedly, a large, dark shape at the edge of the page, with eyes carefully shaded in pencil. She added, "They all say it stands just where the trees go thick." Sheriff Fitch attempted to impose order. He reopened older files looking for patterns: missing persons, animal attacks, unexplained deaths. One case from 1912 caught his attention. A moonshiner found dead near a ravine, cause listed as exposure, though witnesses at the time claimed he had been screaming hours before he was discovered. The file had been closed without comment. Fitch noted similarities but found no evidence strong enough to pursue. The sheriff also interviewed older residents, men and women who had lived in the hills before roads cut through them. Their testimonies were consistent in one respect: the sound was not constant. It came during certain years, then disappeared for long stretches. One woman, Mrs. Lena Hargreave, told Fitch, "It comes when the land's been bothered too much." She refused to explain further. A second disappearance followed before Thanksgiving. This time it was a boy of 16, Joseph Larkin, sent to check a trap line near dusk. He never returned. His father claimed he heard the screaming less than an hour later, closer than ever before. Searchers found Joseph's lantern shattered against a rock face, wick still smelling of fuel. Again, there were no tracks leading away. Ranger Klein's private correspondence from that period, later recovered among his papers, shows a shift in tone. He mentioned the Ozark National Forest by name, noting increased reports along its boundary, as if the sound respected an invisible line. "Whatever it is," he wrote, "it does not cross open ground willingly." By December, snow fell in patches along the higher ridges and the screaming slowed. When it came, it sounded weaker, strained, as though retreating into the hills themselves. No official explanation was ever issued. The cases were left open, then quietly archived. But people did not forget. They marked the places where the sound had lingered longest. They avoided them. And some swore that on certain nights when fog settled just right, the hills still remembered how to scream. Winter pressed down hard on the Ozarks as December deepened, sealing roads beneath ice and thinning the already scarce lines of communication between farms. County correspondence slowed, and what reports did arrive came days late, edges damp and smudged. Yet even as the screaming grew less frequent, the unease it left behind only intensified. People spoke of it the way one speaks of an illness that has passed but might return without warning. Sheriff Fitch ordered a final review before the year's end. His notes show a careful attempt to strip the events of folklore and arrange them as facts, dates, distances, weather conditions. He mapped where each sound had been reported and where each disappearance occurred. The resulting pattern disturbed him. Nearly all clustered along a broken arc that traced the edge of the federal lands associated with the Ozark National Forest, as if whatever caused the disturbance lingered at its margins rather than within its depths. Ranger Klein was called in again, this time formally. Together they walked sections of the boundary on foot, following old game trails and abandoned logging paths. Klein later testified that the forest felt wrongly quiet, even for winter. No birds. No small mammals moving in the undergrowth. On the third day they found a shallow depression near a stand of cedars, the ground pressed flat in an irregular oval. It was not a den nor a campsite. There were no tools, no bedding, no sign of fire, just disturbed earth frozen hard. They documented it anyway. Photographs were taken, though none survive in the county archive. A clerk later claimed the negatives were damaged in storage. Fitch wrote a brief note beside the entry, possibly animal, size unclear. It was the only time he acknowledged uncertainty in writing. As Christmas approached, the screaming stopped altogether. Life resumed cautiously. Children returned to walking in pairs. Timber crews resumed work. The Larkin family held a small service without a body, the minister offering prayers for those lost to the hills. No mention was made of how or why. In January of 1939, a small fire broke out in a records room attached to the county courthouse. Officially, it was blamed on faulty wiring. Several boxes of older affidavits and ranger correspondence were destroyed. Among them were Klein's field notes from the previous autumn. What remained were summaries, references without context, shadows of fuller accounts. Years later, a folklorist from Fayetteville interviewed residents about the Ozark Howler, treating it as a cultural artifact rather than a living fear. One man told him, "It weren't a story that year. It was a warning." The folklorist noted the comment but did not include it in his final paper. Even now, long after those winters passed, hikers near the old boundary trails report a feeling of sudden disorientation at dusk, as if the land folds inward on itself. Some claim to hear distant sounds carried strangely on the wind, too long for an animal, too strained for a human voice. In the Ozarks, places remember what people try to forget. And some nights when fog settles low and the forest grows still, it feels as though the hills are listening, waiting for the right moment to scream again. January 12, 1939 brought a brief thaw to the Ozarks. Ice loosened its grip on the creeks, and wagon roads softened enough for mail to reach outlying farms again. With it came delayed paperwork, death notices, tax receipts, and a thin envelope postmarked from Little Rock, addressed to Sheriff Fitch. Inside was a routine inquiry from the State Forestry Office asking for clarification on unusual disturbances, reported by Ranger William Klein the previous fall. Fitch never replied. By February, Klein had been reassigned to a different district without explanation, a fact quietly noted in personnel rosters but never discussed locally. There were, however, a few solid facts that resisted rumor. Whether logs from the University of Arkansas confirm that October and November of 1938 were unusually wet in the northern Ozarks, with prolonged fog conditions at higher elevations. Sound behaves differently in such conditions, carrying farther and bending in ways that confuse direction. This explanation appeared later in a regional science bulletin, though it did little to account for the specific timing or the repeated human disappearances. Another verifiable detail came from railroad maintenance records. On October 27, 1938, a night crew working a spur line south of Huntsville reported halting work for nearly an hour due to persistent screaming from wooded slopes. The foreman logged it as a safety concern, noting that 2 workers refused to continue until dawn. No folklore terms were used, just the word screaming underlined once. By the spring of 1939, the incidents had slipped from public conversation, replaced by worries more concrete: crop yields, rising prices, the distant news from Europe. Yet private journals tell a different story. Miss Calder wrote in April that several children still refuse to sit near windows during afternoon lessons. They say the hills can see in, she noted, without comment. The Ozark howler returned to its older role, as something spoken of carefully, usually after dark, usually by people who had lived through that autumn. Hunters claimed that deer avoided certain hollows entirely for years afterward. A 1941 conservation survey, real and still archived, shows odd gaps in wildlife sightings along sections of the forest boundary, attributed officially to overhunting but never fully explained. One last document bears mentioning. Dated June 3, 1942, it is a typed letter from a geology professor who had reviewed sinkholes and cave systems in the region. He warned that uncharted limestone cavities could create acoustic anomalies and sudden ground instability. Scribbled in the margin in a different hand is a single line, doesn't explain the voices. No signature accompanies it. After that, the trail thins, people aged, roads improved. Records grew cleaner and more complete, leaving less room for things that did not fit. But the place remained. Locals still avoid certain paths at dusk. Campers still report the sense of being turned around, even with clear landmarks. And sometimes in the Ozarks, when the air is wet and still, especially in late autumn, there are reports of a sound that carries too far, lingers too long, and leaves those who hear it standing quietly, unsure which way leads home. By October of 1943, 5 years after the first reports, the screams had faded into what officials preferred to call local legend. Still, paper trails have a way of persisting where memory softens. A civil defense questionnaire circulated through Madison County that year asked residents to list unusual environmental conditions that might interfere with night drills. 3 households along the old Dry Creek route wrote the same response in different hands. Sound carries wrong here. No further explanation was offered, and none was requested. There are a few things we can say with certainty. U.S. Forest Service maps from 1944 confirm that several informal trails near the Ozark National Forest boundary were permanently closed due to erosion and unexplained ground collapse. Sinkholes are common in the Ozarks, formed by the slow dissolution of limestone beneath the soil. When they open, they can swallow fences, trees, even small structures. In 1939 alone, state geologists recorded more than a dozen new collapses across northern Arkansas. One occurred less than 2 miles from where Joseph Larkin's lantern had been found. Cave systems, too, were more extensive than residents realized. A 1940 survey documented previously unknown caverns capable of producing strong echo effects. Air moving through narrow passages can amplify sound, stretching it, distorting it, making a single cry seem like many. These are known facts, taught plainly in geology courses. What those explanations cannot account for is why the sounds described in 1938 followed such precise hours, or why they coincided so closely with human absence rather than natural disaster. A deposition taken in March 1946 during a routine land dispute includes a curious aside. An elderly farmer named Amos Ridley testified that he refused to sell a strip of his property because it sat over a hollow that wakes up some years. When asked what he meant, he replied only, "Folks hear things there when the fog comes early." The court stenographer noted a pause before the next question, as if no one knew how to proceed. The Ozark howler itself began to change shape in the telling. Younger residents described it more vaguely, sometimes as nothing more than a sound without a body. Older ones kept the older details: the heavy frame, the eyes that caught light, the scream that did not belong to any known animal. In all versions, one rule stayed the same: do not follow the sound and do not answer it. By 1948, improvements in roads and radio coverage reduced isolation. Night travel became safer. Reports of screaming dwindled to near nothing. But absence does not always mean resolution. In a handwritten margin note added to a 1951 forest maintenance log, still within our window of record, a ranger wrote, "Locals still won't camp here after dark." No reason was given. History often closes its files not because questions are answered, but because those who remember stop speaking. Yet the land does not forget so easily. The hollows remain. The caves still breathe air in and out of the hills. And when conditions are right, when fog presses low and sound has nowhere to go, there are still those who claim the Ozarks remember how to make people lose their way. In November of 1952, a small but telling incident appeared in the Arkansas Gazette, buried beneath crop reports and a notice about a county fair. The article described 2 college-aged hikers who had become disoriented while crossing a marked trail near the Upper Buffalo River region. They were found the next morning less than a mile from their campsite, exhausted, convinced they had walked for hours in the wrong direction. One of them told a deputy that during the night they heard a long crying sound that didn't fade like an echo should. The paper attributed their confusion to fatigue and poor visibility. No folklore was mentioned. Forest Service patrol logs from that same decade confirm an increase in minor rescues along certain ridgelines near the Ozark National Forest boundary. None involved injury. None involved missing persons. Still, rangers began advising campers to avoid traveling after dusk when fog was present. Officially, this was due to uneven terrain and sudden drop-offs. Unofficially, locals said it was because people panic easier out there. A more formal document appears in 1957, a University of Arkansas field study on acoustic distortion in mountainous terrain. The researchers demonstrated that under specific humidity and temperature conditions, sound could appear to move, arriving from multiple directions at once. Their conclusion was careful, restrained, and scientifically sound. Yet in the margins of one preserved copy, an unknown reader wrote, "This explains how it carries, not why it starts." Oral histories collected in the early 1960s reveal a quiet persistence of memory. Elderly residents interviewed for a regional heritage project spoke less about the creature itself and more about behavior changes that followed 1938. One woman recalled that her father stopped setting traps in a particular hollow after the screaming year. Another said her family never rebuilt a shed that collapsed during that winter, even though they had the means. "Didn't want to dig there," she said. There is one final disappearance worth noting, dated February 3, 1964. A middle-aged man named Clarence Bowen failed to return from a solo hike along an unmaintained trail. Search teams found no evidence beyond a discarded pack and a compass whose needle had jammed. The official conclusion cited exposure and misadventure. Privately, a volunteer recalled hearing a sound that night like wind pulling through a throat. His statement does not appear in the final report. By the late 1970s, modernization had softened the edges of the Ozarks. Roads were paved, trail markers improved, radios gave way to clearer communication. And yet, hikers and hunters still spoke of certain places with caution. They described a sensation of being watched, of paths seeming longer than they were, of sound lingering just a moment too long. The Ozark howler, by then, had retreated fully into story. Children heard it as a warning tale. Researchers cited it as an example of regional myth-making. But every so often, when conditions aligned, late autumn, heavy fog, deep quiet, someone would report a sound that did not behave like any animal call they knew. No investigation followed those reports. No files were opened. History by then had learned to look away. But the Ozarks remain, and in places where the forest presses close and the land folds inward, there are still those who say the night listens first, before it ever answers back. By the early 1960s, the events of 1938 had settled into a narrow category of county history, acknowledged, referenced, but rarely explored. Yet traces remained in institutional memory. In 1966, during a routine review of older land use agreements near the Ozark National Forest boundary, a junior clerk flagged a series of parcels marked restricted after incident. No incident was described. The designation dated back to 1939. When asked, supervisors advised leaving the language unchanged. That same year, a retired deputy named Calvin Moore gave a recorded interview to a local historical society. He spoke calmly, without embellishment. Moore had been a young patrolman during the screaming year and was assigned night watch along Dry Creek Road. He recalled hearing the sound only once. "It wasn't loud," he said. "It was careful, like it wanted to be heard, not chased. The interviewer attempted to redirect him toward wildlife explanations. Moore did not argue. He simply repeated, "It knew when you were alone." Several verifiable changes followed 1938 that are often overlooked. Property records show at least 4 homesteads along the affected corridor were abandoned between 1939 and 1945, despite no recorded financial hardship. Census notes list the reason simply as relocated. Church attendance logs from Dry Creek Chapel dropped sharply and never fully recovered. Even the cemetery there shows a gap, fewer burials than expected for a growing rural population, suggesting families quietly moved their dead elsewhere. In 1971, a controlled burn conducted by the Forest Service accidentally exposed a collapsed entrance to a small cave system near one of the original sound reports. Surveyors mapped it briefly before declaring it unsafe. Airflow readings taken inside showed pressure changes capable of producing long, wavering sounds when wind conditions shifted. This finding was filed as a satisfactory explanation. No mention was made of why residents had avoided the area for decades prior. Still, not all accounts fit neatly. A 1974 journal kept by a biology graduate student conducting nocturnal wildlife observation includes a short, uneasy passage. Heard prolonged vocalization at 10:47 p.m. duration approx. 18-20 seconds. Source unclear. Ceased abruptly. All animal activity stopped immediately afterward. The entry ends there. No species identification was attempted. The Ozark howler as a name appears less frequently after this period. But the behavior it once explained does not vanish entirely. Hikers continue to report losing their sense of direction along familiar paths. Compasses fail sporadically in damp conditions. Radios cut out briefly in certain hollows. These are minor things, easily dismissed, yet curiously consistent. By the end of the 1970s, most first-hand witnesses were gone. What remained were habits, campsites left unused, trails that locals skirted without comment, advice given quietly to newcomers. Don't walk alone at dusk. Don't follow sounds that don't fade. The hills had learned patience. And in the Ozarks, patience has always been one of the most unsettling qualities of all. In the early 1980s, as regional universities began renewed interest in Appalachian and Ozark oral history, a small grant funded interviews across northern Arkansas. The stated goal was preservation, not investigation. Still, patterns emerged. When asked about local legends, many respondents hesitated before answering. Several redirected the conversation entirely. Others spoke in lowered voices, even though they were being recorded indoors, decades after the events themselves. One interview, dated May 1982, stands out. It was conducted with a woman named Evelyn Price, daughter of the hog farmer who had filed one of the earliest affidavits in 1938. She confirmed her father's statement about the screaming and added a detail absent from the official record. After it happened, she said, he said the woods smelled wrong, like wet fur and turned earth. She paused, then corrected herself. Not all the time, just after the sound. This period also brought a few small but verifiable rediscoveries. While reorganizing storage in a county annex building in 1984, clerks found a mislabeled box of sheriff's correspondence dating from the late 1930s. Most documents were routine, but one carbon copy caught attention: an unsent letter from Sheriff Fitch to the State Wildlife Office requesting guidance on unidentified vocalizations and associated disorientation among residents. The draft was never mailed. A handwritten note at the bottom reads, "Handle locally." That same year, a controlled mapping project of abandoned trails was undertaken to improve hiker safety. Surveyors noted several paths that appeared on older maps but were inexplicably avoided by locals, even when they offered shorter routes. One such trail followed Dry Creek for nearly a mile before climbing sharply into forested ridges. A note beside it reads, "Low usage despite accessibility." No cause was listed. Technological explanations were now easier to suggest. Infrasound, low frequency, sound capable of inducing unease and confusion, had entered public awareness. Researchers acknowledged that certain geological formations could generate it under specific conditions. This explanation satisfied many outside the region. Inside it, people nodded politely and continued to behave as they always had. A park ranger interviewed in 1987 offered a careful summary. "Nothing's ever proven," he said, "but folks don't imagine things the same way over and over for 100 years. Something sets it off." He declined to say more and requested his name be withheld. By then, the Ozark Howler existed mostly in footnotes and campfire warnings, yet reports never fully stopped. They simply became quieter, easier to dismiss. A strange sound logged and forgotten. A hiker turning back early without knowing why. A sense, hard to articulate, that the land itself had moods. As the century drew closer to its end, the Ozarks remained outwardly unchanged, green, patient, unremarkable to those passing through. But beneath that calm lay a long memory, stitched together from affidavits, margins, and voices that learned when silence was safer. And sometimes, when the fog settles early and sound refuses to behave, the hills still seem to lean in, as if listening for someone foolish enough to answer back. In 1989, a modest but telling change appeared in Forest Service safety guidelines distributed to camps and ranger stations across northern Arkansas. Among the usual advice, weather awareness, wildlife precautions, fire safety, was a short, carefully worded line: "Avoid solo travel in low visibility conditions after dusk." No reason was given. The phrasing echoed earlier, informal warnings that had circulated for decades, now translated into bureaucratic language. That same autumn, a graduate thesis from Arkansas State University examined spatial disorientation in wooded environments. The researcher conducted controlled night walks with volunteers in several regions, including the Ozarks. One test site was quietly relocated after multiple participants reported anxiety disproportionate to conditions. Field notes mention auditory anomalies and difficulty locating known landmarks. The final thesis attributed these reactions to environmental stress. The raw notes, archived separately, are more cautious. One line reads, "Sound persists longer here." There were also occasional, verifiable incidents involving emergency services. In October 1991, A hunter named Raymond Ellis contacted authorities after becoming lost less than half a mile from his truck. He told responders he had followed what he believed was another hunter calling out. Search teams found no one else in the area. Ellis was treated for mild hypothermia and released. The official report concludes with a familiar phrase, "No further action required." Local folklore adapted quietly. The Ozark Howler was no longer described in detail. Younger generations often knew only that you don't go looking when you hear something strange. The creature's shape faded, its function remained. It explained why people trusted instinct over maps, silence over curiosity. A final institutional note appears in 1994 when a proposal to develop a new trail loop near the old Dry Creek corridor was withdrawn. Publicly, the reason was cost. Internally, meeting minutes reference anticipated resistance from residents. No petitions were filed, no objections recorded. The resistance existed without needing to be written down. What endures through all these documents is restraint. No one ever claims certainty. No one ever names a cause that demands action. Instead, the records circle the same conclusion without stating it outright. Whatever happened in 1938 did not end so much as it receded, becoming conditional rather than constant. The Ozark National Forest still stands, its boundaries clearer now than they were in the 1930s. Trails are marked, maps are reliable. And yet, even with modern tools, people continue to lose their way there. Briefly, harmlessly, but enough to unsettle them. Perhaps that is the legacy of the Screaming Year. Not proof of a creature, but proof that some places retain the ability to disrupt certainty. To remind those who enter that the land is older than records and less concerned with explanations. And in the Ozarks, when the night grows quiet too suddenly, that reminder still feels uncomfortably close. By 1998, 60 years had passed since the first affidavits were written in pencil and filed without comment. That anniversary went unnoticed officially, but it coincided with a renewed interest in regional environmental history. A small symposium held in Fayetteville that year included a panel on land use changes in the Ozarks during the 1930s. One presenter briefly mentioned localized disturbances reported during the late Depression era, citing timber disputes, wildlife displacement, and acoustic complaints. The audience did not ask questions. Around the same time, a private collection of letters surfaced during the estate settlement of Reverend Mercer's descendants. Among sermons and family correspondence was the original church journal from 1938, intact. In the margins near the October entries, Mercer had added a line years later, likely in the early 1950s. "I wish I had gone to listen myself. Fear is worse when unanswered." It was the only personal reflection he ever allowed himself on the matter. Technological advances brought new language but not new clarity. Portable audio equipment became common among researchers and hobbyists. In October 2001, an amateur sound recordist camping near the Buffalo River captured a prolonged call shortly after nightfall. The recording circulated briefly among local enthusiasts. Analysis suggested no known animal source. Others argued it was wind interacting with terrain. The file was eventually lost when the host server shut down. What remains are second-hand descriptions, long, wavering, ending abruptly. County emergency logs from 2004 show a spike in short-duration search calls during fog-heavy weeks, people disoriented, then found quickly, often embarrassed. One dispatcher noted in a private notebook, "Always the same area." The area was not named, but the map coordinates match older reports along the forest boundary. Cultural memory continued to thin. By the late 2000s, the Ozark Howler appeared mostly in novelty books and tourist folklore, stripped of its darker associations. Yet locals noticed that newcomers repeated old behaviors without being told, avoiding certain hollows, choosing longer routes at dusk, falling quiet when sound behaved strangely. A park maintenance worker interviewed in 2010 summarized it plainly. "Nothing ever happens. That's the strange part. People just don't stay." He had no story to tell, only an observation repeated by others who worked the land long enough to notice patterns. As records grow denser and explanations more sophisticated, the gap remains where certainty should be. The events of 1938 never resolved into a single narrative. They scattered instead, into journals, margins, habits, and silences, each piece plausible on its own, unsettling in accumulation. And the Ozarks continue as they always have, offering no conclusions. Just forests where sound lingers, paths that subtly mislead, and nights when the hills seem to hold their breath, waiting, as they did once before, to be heard again. In the mid-2010s, a subtle shift occurred in how the region's past was discussed, not publicly, but among archivists and local historians. Digitization projects brought old materials back into view, sometimes without the context that had once softened them. When Madison County's records were scanned in 2016, several 1938 affidavits resurfaced online for the first time. Readers unfamiliar with the terrain found them puzzling. Those who lived nearby recognized the locations immediately. One archivist, tasked with tagging the documents, added a quiet note to an internal log, multiple references to sound-related fear. Not typical for the period. It was not meant as analysis, just classification. Still, it marked a return of attention to something long set aside. Around that same period, park rangers informally compared notes. A few mentioned that visitor reports of unusual noises tended to cluster in late October and early November, the same weeks noted in 1938. No official study followed. Patterns, after all, require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement invites questions. A verified incident from October 2018 illustrates the point. A group of 4 campers near an undeveloped section of trail called in a false emergency after hearing what they believed was a person screaming for help. Rangers reached them within the hour. No one else was found. The campers insisted the sound had come from close by, then farther away, then nowhere at all. The report concludes, "No threat identified." Technology now allows nearly everything to be recorded, yet some experiences resist capture. Phones fail in low valleys. Audio clips distort. GPS tracks show clean lines even when walkers swear they veered off course. These inconsistencies are usually blamed on user error. Sometimes that explanation is enough. In a 2020 oral history update, one elderly resident, too young to remember 1938 but raised by those who did, offered a careful reflection. They didn't think it was a monster, he said. They thought it was a place acting up. When asked what that meant, he smiled slightly. Some ground doesn't like to be crossed certain ways. The Ozark Howler as a term has nearly disappeared again, but the behaviors it once explained remain remarkably stable across generations. People avoid being alone after dark in certain hollows. They don't follow voices they can't place. They trust the feeling that tells them to turn back, even when nothing appears wrong. History often demands conclusions. This story does not provide one. It offers instead a narrow corridor of time, beginning in 1938, rooted in a specific landscape, where records, testimony, and folklore overlap just enough to be uncomfortable. The Ozarks endure beyond that corridor, unchanged in appearance, altered only by memory. And when the air is wet and the hills hold sound too long, some still feel that old hesitation, the sense that the night is not empty, only quiet and listening. By 2023, the story of the Screaming Year existed in fragments scattered across platforms that did not speak to one another. Digitized affidavits sat beside hiking blogs. Academic footnotes brushed against campfire warnings. No single narrative connected them, and perhaps that was fitting. The original events had never unfolded as a single story either, only as moments linked by place and sound. One small but verifiable detail emerged that year during a survey of aging infrastructure. Engineers assessing erosion risks near the Upper Dry Creek watershed referenced an old Forest Service restriction dating back to 1939. The language was unchanged. Limited access recommended due to unstable ground and historical incidents. No one could say who wrote the final clause or what incidents it referred to. The recommendation was upheld without debate. Sound studies have advanced considerably since the 1930s. Researchers now understand how temperature inversion, humidity, and terrain can carry noise over great distances, bending it, reshaping it. They can model how a single source might seem to move, how echoes might overlap. These explanations are real, measurable, and persuasive. What they still cannot model is response. Why people react the way they do. Why certain sounds provoke fear without clear cause. A ranger interviewed anonymously in late 2024 described receiving occasional reports that never make it into formal logs. People call and hang up, he said, or they just ask if anyone else is camping nearby. When told no, they thank him and leave early. No emergency. No incident, just departure. Looking back within our narrow historical window, from 1938 through the closing decades of the 20th century, a pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The screams did not escalate toward revelation. They did not culminate in discovery. Instead, they receded, leaving behind altered behavior rather than answers. That may be why the story endures. It never resolved itself into something manageable. The Ozark Howler, whether viewed as folklore or shorthand, served a purpose during that time. It gave shape to an experience that resisted naming. It allowed people to warn one another without making claims they could not prove. And when the sound faded, the name faded with it, leaving only the caution behind. There is no final document that closes the case. No report that explains the screams, the disappearances, the disorientation. Only a long series of choices, paths not taken, places avoided, questions left unasked. History records those choices quietly, if at all. And the Ozarks remain what they have always been: ridges and hollows, fog and stone, sound that carries farther than it should. A landscape capable of holding memory without preserving proof. So when someone says the hills scream, they are rarely asking to be believed. They are passing along a habit, shaped by decades of listening and choosing not to answer. And in the Ozarks, that habit still feels necessary. If there is a final thread worth following, it is not a document or a sighting, but a change in how people move through the land. Travel journals from the late 20th century, kept by hikers, hunters, and amateur naturalists, show subtle but repeated deviations. Routes bend away from certain draws. Campsites are chosen higher than necessary. Night walks end early, even when weather and energy allow otherwise. These choices are rarely explained. They simply appear, consistent across decades. One such journal, dated October 1986 and later donated to a regional archive, records a lone backpacker's decision to turn back before dusk. "Nothing wrong," he wrote, "just felt like the air went tight." He had no knowledge of the events of 1938, no exposure to the Ozark Howler legend. Yet his behavior mirrored those who had heard the screaming directly nearly 50 years earlier. County maps offer another quiet confirmation. When trail systems were redrawn in the 1970s and again in the 1990s, certain low-lying corridors were repeatedly excluded. Official reasons cited erosion, flooding, and maintenance difficulty. All valid. Yet these same corridors appear in earlier affidavits, journals, and search reports tied to the screaming year. The land itself seems to have made the decision easier by resisting use. Even language shifted. Older residents stopped saying they heard something and began saying the hills were active. It was a careful term, vague enough to avoid argument. Activity did not require explanation. It only required response. You stayed alert. You left early. You didn't linger where sound behaved badly. The Ozark National Forest, often mentioned in early reports as a boundary rather than a source, remains a constant presence throughout the record. Its creation and expansion altered human movement, pushed settlements, changed hunting patterns. It did not create the screams, but it framed them, giving them edges, borders, places to gather and retreat. In that way, the forest became part of the story without ever speaking. By the time the 20th century closed, the screaming year had lost its urgency but not its shape. It survived as alignment between memory and terrain. Ask someone why they avoid a place and the answer is rarely dramatic. Just don't like it. Never felt right. Sound does funny things there. These are not claims, they are inheritances. History often favors events with conclusions, fires extinguished, criminals caught, mysteries solved. This case offers none of that. Instead, it leaves us with continuity. The same weeks of the year, the same conditions, the same quiet decisions repeated by people who never met one another. And so the file remains open, not because new evidence appears, but because the land itself continues to participate. The Ozarks do not announce what they remember. They simply behave as though something once passed through and never fully left. When fog settles into the hollows and sound stretches longer than it should, the old instinct returns. Not panic, not belief, just the sense that listening too closely might invite a reply. In the late 1970s, before digitization and long before the story drifted into novelty, a quiet review took place inside the Arkansas Historical Commission. The project concerned Depression-era rural disruptions, nothing unusual. Yet one researcher, Margaret Ellison, noted an anomaly in her working papers. She observed that several unrelated files from 1938 and 1939 referenced sound as a primary cause of behavioral change. Not violence, not famine, sound. She underlined the word twice. Ellison attempted to trace outcomes. Where did the affected families go? Why did certain parcels remain unused? Why did complaints stop without resolution? Her notes show growing frustration. In a margin dated 1978, she wrote, "Records thin out not because the problem ends, but because people adapt." It was an academic observation, but it carried weight. That same year, a Forest Service safety circular, never released publicly, recommended limiting night patrols in fog-heavy conditions along specific ridgelines. The circular cited no threat, only disorientation risk. One ranger added a handwritten addendum, same areas as old reports. The reports were not attached. By 1981, the last generation with living memory of the screaming year was fading. Oral history interviews captured fragments rather than narratives. A former timber worker recalled that his crew used to whistle while walking back to camp at night. "Not loud," he said, "just enough so you knew where you were." When asked why, he shrugged. "Sounds funny out there." What never appeared in any formal record was panic. There were no mass departures, no vigilante hunts, no hysteria. That absence is notable. The response to the screaming was restraint. People stayed indoors. They avoided certain places. They waited. When the sound stopped, they did not seek explanations. They simply remembered. One final document from 1986 brings the file as close to closure as it ever comes. A regional planning memo discusses trail maintenance priorities and notes, almost as an aside, that historical avoidance patterns align with natural preservation goals. In other words, places people stayed away from had been left intact. The land, undisturbed, had kept its secrets. The Ozark Howler, by that point, was no longer necessary as a name. The behavior it once justified had become instinct. You didn't go out alone at night when fog sat low. You didn't follow voices you couldn't place. You trusted the quiet warning that told you to turn back. That may be the truest legacy of 1938. Not a creature, not a scream, but a shared understanding between people and place. An agreement formed without words and honored without explanation. And the Ozarks, patient as ever, continue to hold up their end of it. As the 1980s drew to a close, the story reached the edge of what can reasonably be called living record. By 1988, 50 years had passed since the autumn when the hills first screamed, and most official attention had shifted elsewhere. What remained were the last custodians of memory, men and women who had been children in 1938, now elderly, careful with their words. One such account appears in a taped interview conducted in the summer of 1987 by a county librarian named Howard Bell. The interviewee, Nora Jenkins, was 12 years old during the screaming year. Bell asked her what she remembered most. She did not mention fear. She mentioned silence. After it stopped, she said, nobody talked much for a while, like we were waiting to see if the land was done. That sentiment appears elsewhere, though rarely so plainly. Agricultural logs from 1939 show delayed planting in certain low areas, even when conditions improved. Families favored higher ground. The choice made sense on paper, less flood risk, but it also aligned closely with where the sound had traveled most strongly. Practical decisions often carry older reasons beneath them. By the late 1980s, trail maintenance crews working near the Ozark National Forest boundary followed informal guidance passed down rather than written policy. One supervisor recalled being told, "Don't open that path unless you have to." When asked why, he was given no answer. He didn't press the issue. What historians sometimes miss is how effectively communities conceal an experience without erasing it. The screaming of 1938 never became a cautionary tale with a moral. It became something closer to weather, unpredictable, remembered, respected. When the conditions returned, fog, isolation, stillness, people adjusted their behavior without discussion. There were no final sightings, no last cries recorded in logbooks. The sound did not announce its departure. It simply ceased, leaving behind a map of altered habits and quiet borders drawn across the land. Those borders persist not because anyone enforces them, but because memory does. Within the formal limits of record and testimony, this is where the trail thins. After 1988, references become indirect, second-hand, shaped more by interpretation than experience. To go further would be to leave the case file and enter speculation. So we stop here, at the edge of memory, where history traditionally closes its doors. The Ozarks remain much as they were, forested, folded, patient. The Ozark National Forest stands as both witness and boundary, its presence shaping movement without explanation. And if the hills have not screamed again in the same way, that does not mean they are silent. Only that whatever once passed through learned, as people did, the value of waiting. What lingers after a case like this is not evidence but alignment. The documents, testimonies, and absences never contradict one another outright. They simply refuse to converge. Each points in roughly the same direction without ever arriving at a destination. For historians, this is often the most difficult kind of record to accept. By the early 1990s, a few regional scholars attempted to revisit the events of 1938 through interdisciplinary lenses: acoustics, geology, psychology. Their findings were presented cautiously, often hedged with qualifiers. One paper concluded that environmental factors likely contributed to a shared perceptual experience. Another suggested localized fear amplification in isolated communities. Neither addressed why those experiences clustered so tightly in time and place, or why they produced such durable behavioral change. What stands out, looking back within our enclosed window, is the lack of escalation. No one tried to hunt the source. No organized searches pushed deep into the hills at night. Even the sheriff and rangers limited their efforts. It is as though the community collectively sensed that pursuit was the wrong response. The safest action was to wait, to let the hills finish whatever they were doing. That restraint appears again and again in the record. Sheriff Fitch's unsent letters, Ranger Klein's careful phrasing, Reverend Mercer's regret at not listening, paired with his decision not to preach about it. These were not people prone to panic. They were people accustomed to hardship. Their caution carries weight. The Ozark Howler, when viewed through this lens, feels less like an explanation and more like a boundary marker. It named the edge of understanding. Beyond it lay speculation, and the community chose not to cross. The legend did not encourage fear so much as discipline. Stay together, trust your bearings, do not follow what you cannot see. Even the disappearances resist narrative closure. No remains were found. No trails extended outward. They end instead in stillness, lantern glass on stone, a hat in dry brush, a coat left behind. These are not scenes of violence. They are scenes of interruption, as if something simply stopped. And so the case file closes not with resolution, but with containment. The events of 1938 are held within their time, bounded by memory and landscape. They do not demand belief. They do not offer proof. They persist only as a caution written into behavior and place. The Ozarks have always been good at this, absorbing disturbance, smoothing its surface, leaving only faint contours for those who know how to look. Paths curve, trails vanish, sound carries farther than expected, and in certain hollows, when the fog settles just right and the night grows too attentive, it still feels wise to listen briefly, then turn back before the hills decide to answer. The last entry relevant to this case does not appear in a ledger, a report, or an archive. It exists instead in a pattern still quietly observed. Locals will tell you that late October is the wrong time to test your luck in the Ozarks, not because of storms or animals or any single danger that can be named, just because the land behaves differently then. Sound lingers. Distance lies. Direction becomes a suggestion rather than a rule. This was true in 1938, when the screams first cut through the night and forced a community to redraw its boundaries without ever putting ink to paper. It remained true in the decades that followed, as people adapted without explanation and passed those adaptations down as instinct. The Ozark National Forest still marks the edge of many of those behaviors, not as a source, but as a line where something once gathered and chose not to cross. There is no final witness, no last scream preserved on tape. The case never resolves into a single answer because it was never a single question. It was a convergence of place, time, and attention, of a landscape briefly refusing to behave the way people expected it to. Folklore gave it a shape, calling it the Ozark Howler. Records gave it dates and margins. Science offered partial explanations that addressed mechanics but not meaning. None of these are wrong. None of them are complete. What remains is the echo. Not a sound you can point to, but a hesitation that still surfaces when the fog settles low and the hills fall too quiet. Hikers pause without knowing why. Campers pack up early. Locals choose the long way home as evening comes on. These are not acts of fear. They are acts of memory. The Ozarks have always been a place where stories do not end so much as they recede, folding back into the ridges and hollows that first gave them voice. Some nights it is enough to know that something once moved through here, announced itself, and then withdrew, leaving the land altered just enough to be felt. And if on a still autumn night you hear a sound that carries too far and lingers too long, the old advice remains unchanged. Do not follow it. Do not answer it. Let the hills keep what they remember, because in the Ozarks the night does not always scream. Sometimes it waits.